Hook. The man didn't hesitate. He grabbed her by the arm and threw her off the pier. She hit the Pacific at 5:47 in the morning, in the dark, in 48-degree water, while he laughed. She was 52 years old. She had survived 3 combat deployments, 2 classified operations that will never appear in any public record, and 30 years of being told she didn't belong anywhere near this world. He didn't know any of that. He saw a woman in running gear standing on a restricted training pier, and he made a decision in under 3 seconds. It was the worst decision of his career. If this story already has you gripped, follow along until the very end, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go. The pier at Kellerman Naval Station jutted 40 feet into the Pacific like a concrete accusation. At that hour, not quite dawn, the sky more charcoal than black, it was technically off-limits to personnel without active training assignments. The sign said so. The chain-link gate said so. The 2 guards posted at the landward entrance said so, although they'd waved her through without a word after she'd shown her access card, and they'd looked at it and gone slightly pale. Vice Admiral Mara Voss walked to the end of the pier alone. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the water. The Pacific in early November was the color of old iron, and it moved in long, slow swells that hit the pilings and broke apart without much drama. Somewhere out past the breakwater, a buoy clanged. The sound carried in that flat, hollow way sounds do before the world fully wakes up. She wasn't here to train. She wasn't here for a briefing or a walkthrough or any of the dozen logistical reasons a flag officer might appear unannounced at a forward installation at 0530. She was here because 31 years ago, her father had stood on a pier almost exactly like this one and told her that women like her needed to find a different ambition. She'd been 21, home on break from the Naval Academy, still raw and uncertain about most things, but not about that. Not about the Navy. "You'll make a fine nurse," he'd said. He hadn't meant it as an insult. That was the part that always stuck. He'd meant it as a reasonable assessment of what was possible. Rear Admiral Edmund Voss had spent 22 years in the naval special warfare community. He knew what it demanded. He knew what it broke. He'd watched good men wash out, watched exceptional men fall apart under pressure that had no name, and in his mind, built by a generation that didn't question certain categories of thought, there was simply no version of that world that included his daughter. She'd stopped arguing with him sometime around year 3 of her career, when she realized the argument was unanswerable. You couldn't explain yourself to someone who'd already decided what you were. So she'd stopped explaining. She'd started working. The water below the pier looked like it was maybe 47, 48 degrees. She'd checked the forecast the night before out of habit. Old habit. The kind you pick up when water temperature is a tactical variable, not a discomfort rating. She heard boots on the pier behind her. Fast, heavy, deliberate. The stride of someone who assumed they had authority in this space, which, to be fair, most people who walked that pier did. She didn't turn around. "Hey." The voice was young, late 20s, maybe 30. "This section's restricted." "I'm aware," she said. A pause. He'd expected her to turn around, probably, or to apologize and start moving. She did neither. "Ma'am?" The word landed with an edge that had nothing polite in it. "I'm going to need you to clear the pier." She turned then, slowly, because she was tired and because she'd slept 4 hours in a hotel 14 miles away, and because she'd been doing this for 3 decades and she still had to manage her face every time. She looked at him. Petty officer, by the rank on his physical training gear. Big, maybe 6'2", built the way SEAL candidates got built after about 18 months of sustained punishment. His face said he'd never once considered the possibility that he might be wrong about something. "Your name," she said. "Petty Officer Darren Krall." He said it like it was a credential. "And this pier is for active Bud/S instruction only, sir." He added the honorific belatedly, as if he just remembered it existed. "I know what this pier is for." "Then you know you need to move." She held his gaze for a moment. There was nothing to be gained by telling him who she was in a parking lot conversation. That wasn't how she operated and hadn't been for years. She was going to say something measured, And then she was going to walk back down the pier, and this was going to be a 15-second interaction she'd forget by breakfast. She started to turn. His hand closed around her upper arm. Not roughly enough to be classified as assault in a written report, but rough enough that she felt the intention behind it. The fundamental animal assumption that her presence here was an inconvenience he was entitled to resolve with his hands. She'd felt it before. The grip that said, "You are something to be moved." "Let go," she said. Quiet. Not a request. He didn't let go. He turned her, pivoted her toward the edge, said, "Come on, sweetheart, let's go," and shoved her off the pier. She hit the water shoulder first and went under. The cold was immediate and absolute, but the kind that snatches the breath from your body before your brain has finished registering that you're wet. 47 degrees, she'd checked. She knew exactly how fast a body lost dexterity in 47-degree water, and she knew exactly how long you had before that dexterity stopped being a hypothetical concern. And that knowledge was the only thing that kept the shock from becoming panic. She surfaced, grabbed the nearest piling, got her bearings. Above her, Crawl was already walking away, back up the pier, one hand raised in a dismissive wave like he'd resolved something. She hung in the water for 3 seconds, just breathed. Then she started moving toward the ladder. Crawl was 30 feet up the pier when he heard the shouting. Not general shouting, not the competitive noise of training, not the rhythmic cadence of an instructor working a class. This was the specific high-pitched frequency of someone who had just realized something had gone very, very wrong and was trying to compress the consequences into words fast enough to outrun them. "Where is she?" "Crawl." "Where is the Vice Admiral?" He stopped walking. Lieutenant Commander Phoebe Ames came at a dead sprint down the pier, and she was moving the way officers moved when careers were evaporating in real time. She was 34, compact, dark hair pulled tight, and her face had gone the color of uncooked dough. "Where is she?" Ames said. Not a question, a directed accusation. Crawl turned. There was a woman on the restricted. "Where is she?" He pointed at the water. Ames looked. Mara Voss was at the ladder, hauling herself up the last 3 rungs with the precise economy of someone who had climbed things under worse conditions than this. She was dripping. Her hair was plastered flat. The running jacket she wore was dark with seawater and clung to her like a second skin. She stepped back onto the pier and stood there for a moment, hands at her sides, water running off her in steady streams. She looked at Crawl with an expression that was nearly impossible to read. Not rage, not satisfaction, not grief. Something quieter than all of those. Ames positioned herself between them. Her voice had dropped to something controlled and terrible. "Petty Officer Crawl. That is Vice Admiral Mara Voss. She is the commanding officer of Naval Special Operations Command, and she is here on official inspection orders." A pause. "Tell me you understood something I just said." Crawl's mouth opened. Nothing came out. At the far end of the pier, the base had already started to react. 2 senior officers were moving at pace from the main building, and behind them, a third, Captain Dern Hallstrom, the installation commander, recognizable by his height and the specific quality of his walk, which right now communicated a man who had just been informed of a catastrophic systems failure and was calculating damage in real time. Mara pulled her jacket away from her skin with 2 fingers, let it fall back. "Lieutenant Commander," she said, "what's my 0800 schedule?" Ames blinked. Inspection briefing, Command Conference Room B, operational review with the senior staff, followed by a training observation with reschedule the OH-700 PT review. She looked down at herself with something that might have been mild irritation. "I need dry clothes." "Of course, ma'am. And tell whoever's running the duty desk that I'd like the full personnel roster for Bravo Troop on my table before 0730. "Yes, ma'am." Crawl still hadn't moved. He was standing 5 feet away, and the process of understanding what had happened to his life was visibly running behind his face like a system trying to boot from a dead drive. Mara looked at him once more. Not for long. "Report to Conference Room B at 800, she said. "Don't be late." She walked past him, wet boots leaving prints on the concrete, and went to meet Captain Hallstrom without breaking stride. Hallstrom was 60, silver-haired, and had the particular bearing of a man who had survived enough institutional disasters to know that his first job right now was damage control, and his second job was absolute deference. He met her at the foot of the pier with his hands clasped and his expression arranged into something that attempted to communicate apology and professionalism simultaneously. Vice Admiral Voss. He fell into step beside her. I cannot begin to... Walk with me, Captain. She didn't slow down. He matched her pace. The incident, what happened? That's not reflective of how this command operates, and I want you to know that action will be... Captain, she glanced at him. Is the conference room set up? A beat. Yes, ma'am. Good. I need 15 minutes and a change of clothes from my transport bag. After that, I want to sit down with your senior staff and we're going to go through the operational readiness reports from the last 8 months. She paused. All of them, not the summaries. Hallstrom processed that. Yes, ma'am. I'm also going to need the training injury logs and the disciplinary record for Bravo Troop going back 14 months. She looked at him steadily. Do we have an issue with that? No, ma'am. No issue. She nodded once. They walked in silence for several steps. Boots on wet concrete, the base starting to fully wake around them, lights in windows, voices from the barracks, the distant mechanical groan of a vehicle starting somewhere across the compound. The petty officer, Hallstrom said carefully. I assume you'll want to... I want to see the records first. She said it without particular heat. I've learned not to make decisions before I have the full picture. He went quiet again. She could feel him recalibrating, the relief of someone who'd expected immediate fire and gotten something colder and more precise instead. That was usually more unsettling in the end. Mara had noticed this early in her career. People who expected anger were rarely prepared for patience. They reached the main building. An aide held the door. She walked through and began shedding the wet outer layer in the hallway, and nobody said a word, and that was the correct response. She'd been 52 for 3 weeks. She'd marked the day in a hotel room in Anchorage during a logistics review that had run 16 hours, and the only acknowledgement had been a text from her brother that said Happy Birthday, M, and a voicemail from her assistant that she hadn't listened to until the following morning. She didn't much mind. Birthdays had never been the kind of occasion she organized herself around, and at 52 there was enough distance from the parts of her life she'd lost or given up that she could look at them without flinching. Most of them. Hallstrom's aide had retrieved her transport bag from the vehicle and set it outside a small office on the building's first floor. She went in, closed the door, and changed into dry clothes with the methodical speed of someone who'd been doing it under worse conditions than a quiet institutional hallway. Green-gray wool socks, dry pants, a fresh undershirt. She toweled her hair and didn't look in the mirror more than necessary. Her phone had 11 new messages. She scanned them without opening most of them. 3 from her staff in D.C., 1 from the Inspector General's office, 2 from numbers she didn't immediately recognize, and 1 from a contact saved only as E. Voss. She looked at that last one for a moment. Didn't open it. Put the phone in her pocket. The inspection at Kellerman had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. What wasn't on any external calendar, what wasn't written anywhere that civilian eyes might find, was the reason behind it. Kellerman's Bravo Troop had been the subject of an internal flag in August, filed by a junior officer whose name was now protected under formal whistleblower guidelines. The flag described a pattern: training injuries being logged as equipment failures, performance reviews altered after the fact, a climate that discouraged reporting. Small things, individually. The kind of small things that, in aggregate, built the foundation for something much worse. Mara had read the flag report 3 times. She'd also read the service records of the 14 men currently assigned to Bravo Troop's senior cadre, including the commanding officer, Commander Brett Solis. Solis was decorated, capable on paper, and had 2 formal complaints in his record from 7 years apart that had both been resolved without action. She'd noted that, too. She'd requested this assignment herself. She hadn't told Hallstrom that, and she wouldn't. It wasn't his business yet. She laced her boots, stood, and checked her watch. 11 minutes. She walked back out into the hallway. Ames was waiting. The lieutenant commander had composed herself somewhat, though there was still a residual quality of controlled horror in her posture that Mara recognized, the specific tension of someone who'd arrived 14 seconds too late to prevent something and was still processing whether those 14 seconds defined them. "You're not responsible for what happened on the pier," Mara said. Ames looked at her. "Ma'am, I was supposed to meet you at the gate at 0520. I was delayed by Lieutenant Commander." A pause. "I've been getting places by myself for 30 years. I didn't need an escort to find the pier." She moved past her. "Let's get the briefing room set up." The men who filed into conference room B at 800 had various faces, but they all carried some version of the same expression. The look of people who knew something had happened and weren't sure yet how much of it touched them. Commander Brett Solis came in third. He was 44, broad-shouldered, face still carrying the last remnants of a summer tan, and he'd clearly spent the past hour deciding on an approach. He landed on confident but measured, which Mara had seen before and which was almost always the choice of someone who was calculating rather than reacting. She'd already read his file twice. "Vice Admiral," he said, extending a hand. She shook it once, cleanly. "Commander Solis, sit down." 8 men around the table, Ames along the wall, taking notes. 2 aides near the door. Outside the room's single window, the base was fully operational now. The mist had burned off, and pale November light lay flat across the compound. She opened the first folder. "We're going to start with the injury logs," she said. "Specifically, the 7 training incidents logged between February and September of this year, all coded as equipment-related." A beat of silence. "Equipment failures," Solis said carefully. "Those were reviewed, and I've read the reviews." She flipped a page. "I've also read the original medical reports filed by the base physician before the logs were finalized. There are some discrepancies I'd like to walk through." Nobody moved. The room had that quality of suspended time that Mara had learned to recognize. The moment just before people understood that what was happening was real and not theoretical. She kept her voice even, unhurried. She laid out the first discrepancy. A fractured wrist logged as the result of faulty safety equipment, when the physician's initial notes described an impact pattern inconsistent with the stated cause. She laid out the second, a soft tissue injury listed as caused by a defective harness, when the same physician had written, in an initial note that had apparently been overlooked, "Patient reports direct physical contact from instructor." She didn't editorialize. She just read. By the 4th discrepancy, Commander Solis had stopped trying to interrupt. By the 6th, 2 of the men along the table had exchanged a look that they immediately regretted. Mara saw it. She didn't react. She filed it. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked up. "I want individual sessions with each of you," she said. "Starting this afternoon, 30 minutes each, beginning at 1300. I want your testimony on the record about each of these incidents, not summaries. Your specific recollections." She paused. "If there's anything you want to tell me now, before those sessions, I'm available." Silence. "All right," she said. "Dismissed. Commander Solis." A moment. The men filed out. Solis stayed. He waited until the room had cleared before he leaned back slightly in his chair, a micro-performance of ease, and said, "I want you to know that what happened on the pier this morning that's not what I'm keeping you for." He stopped. "Tell me about Lieutenant Ferris," she said. Something shifted in his face. "Not much. He was disciplined, but enough." "Ferris left the command in September. Voluntary transfer." "Whose recommendation?" A careful pause. "It was discussed jointly." She looked at him for a long moment. "The transfer request was filed 11 days after Lieutenant Ferris submitted the second internal complaint about injury documentation." She let that land. "The timing's interesting." Solis's jaw tightened. "Coincidental?" "Maybe." She closed the second folder. "I'm going to find out." She stood. He stood too, because that was protocol. "Commander," she said, "I want your personnel files on my desk before 1100, all of them, including the ones that haven't been through formal routing yet." "That's an unusual—" "Yes," she said. "It is." She walked out. The hallway outside was quiet. Ames fell into step beside her without being asked. "The crawl situation," Mara said. Captain Hallstrom has him in a holding pattern. He's been pulled from training duty pending. I want his full service record before 1300, not the abbreviated version. She paused at the end of the corridor, looked out through a narrow window at the compound. 2 trainees were crossing the far side of the yard at a jog, heads down, carrying gear. She watched them for a second. How long has he been with Bravo Troop? 8 months, ma'am. 8 months. She made a note of that internally. 8 months was enough time to absorb a culture, to understand what was tolerated, to learn which corners you could cut and who you could treat as less than without consequence. He's not the first thing I care about here, she said, but he's part of it. Understood, ma'am. She started walking again. Get me coffee. Not whatever's in the break room. There's a place on Coastal Road. I saw it when we drove in. Send someone. Ames almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. Buh. At 10:47, an aide knocked on the door of the small office Mara had commandeered and handed her a printed message. It was flagged from the Inspector General's office in D.C., a confirmation that the formal investigation she'd quietly requested 6 weeks ago had been opened and that a senior IG investigator would be arriving at Kellerman within 72 hours. She read it twice, folded it, put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. Outside the window, the Pacific was visible at the edge of the compound, gray-green and restless, running white caps in the morning wind. She'd spent a fair portion of her career near water. It hadn't made her love it exactly, but it had made her honest about it. Water didn't care. It was just pressure and temperature and the laws of physics, and it would kill you or it wouldn't, depending on your preparation and your choices, not on whether you deserved to survive. She thought, briefly, about the man who'd taught her that. Her father, standing on a pier in Westbrook Point, Virginia, when she was 8 years old. Not the pier where he'd told her she didn't belong, that came later, but a different pier, a smaller one, where he'd taught her to tie a bowline knot in under 20 seconds, because he said a knot that slipped was a death you'd chosen. She'd been a serious child, and she'd learned the knot, and then she'd learned everything else, because that was who she was, and that had never had anything to do with whether anyone else approved of it. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. E. Voss again. This time she opened it. Heard you were in Coronado region. Call me when you can. She put the phone face down on the desk. Her father was 76 and had been retired for 9 years and still had some version of the old network, the informal architecture of former operators who kept track of each other's whereabouts out of habit or loyalty or something that had no clean name. He'd know she was in the area within hours of her arrival. She'd expected that. She hadn't decided yet what to do about it. At 10:55, she pulled the Bravo Troop personnel files toward her and opened the first one. At 11:48, she found what she'd been looking for buried in a transfer notation from 14 months ago. A single line in a routing document that connected Commander Solis to a formal fitness report alteration on a junior officer who had since left the Navy entirely. The alteration had been logged as administrative correction. It hadn't been. She sat back in the chair, looked at the ceiling for a moment, the kind of thing that took years to build and seconds to see once you knew where to look. Her coffee, finally delivered, had gone cold on the corner of the desk. She drank it anyway. At 11:57, 3 minutes before her afternoon session schedule was supposed to begin, Captain Hallstrom knocked on the door and came in without waiting to be asked, which told her something about his current state of mind. His face had a quality she recognized, the pre-apology face, the one men wore when they were about to try to explain something they'd already understood they couldn't explain. "Vice Admiral," he said, "I need to make you aware of something." She set down the folder. "Sit down, Captain." He sat. He clasped his hands on the table, looked at them, then at her. "Commander Solis made a call this morning, after the briefing, before 1100. She waited. He called Rear Admiral Holt's office in San Diego. Hallstrom's voice was flat and careful, like a man choosing his words with specific awareness that they were being recorded in some form. "I don't have the content of the call, but I have the log, the timing, and the destination." He paused. "I thought you should know." Rear Admiral Holt. She knew the name. 3-star, Pacific Fleet Command, 26 years of service, and a reputation for protecting his people in ways that occasionally bent the definition of his people beyond what the org chart technically justified. She held Hallstrom's gaze. "Captain," she said, "are you telling me this because you think it changes something?" He considered that carefully. "No, ma'am. I'm telling you because you're the ranking officer in this building, and you're entitled to full situational awareness." She nodded slowly. "All right." She picked up the folder again. "Get me Solis's phone logs for the last 48 hours. All of them. That'll require us. I have the authorization." She slid a document across the desk. He looked at it. She watched his face process it. The IG letterhead, the scope of the investigation, the authority that had quietly moved into this building when she'd walked in that morning soaking wet and nobody had been looking at what she was carrying. He looked up. "When did this start?" he said. Not a question exactly, more like a man rereading a map and understanding he'd been oriented wrong. "August," she said. "The investigation's been open since August." He was quiet for a moment. "The incident this morning," he said. "On the pier." She looked at him. "What about it?" "Did you—" He stopped himself, started again. "Were you aware of who Kral was before—" "I'd reviewed the personnel roster, yes." She met his gaze without apology. "I didn't know he'd be on the pier. I went there because I go to piers. It's a habit." A pause. "What happened this morning was his choice. What happens next is mine." Hallstrom sat with that for a moment. Then he nodded once, stood, and took the authorization document with him when he left. Mara turned back to the files. The afternoon light had shifted. The Pacific outside had gone from gray to something closer to silver, and the whitecaps had settled. In 40 minutes, she would begin the individual sessions. In 72 hours, the IG investigator would arrive. In some number of days after that, this would resolve into whatever it resolved into, and she would move on to the next thing, because that was the nature of the work. She uncapped her pen and wrote a name on a clean sheet of paper. Lieutenant Ferris, 29 years old, medical discharge pending, last known location, Tucson, Arizona. She needed to find him before anyone else did. She'd already sent the request before she'd gotten off the plane, but she hadn't told anyone that either, and she wasn't going to. Some things you moved on quietly and alone, without announcement, because announcement gave the wrong people time to prepare. Her phone buzzed again on the desk. She didn't look at it. Outside, somewhere across the compound, a training class was running. She could hear the count, distant and rhythmic, the sound of bodies in motion under instruction. She listened to it for a moment without meaning to. She'd never gone through BUD/S. She'd never been permitted to try. That door had been closed before she was old enough to understand the full shape of the closing. She'd grieved it, back in the early years, in the particular private way you grieved the roads you didn't get to take. Not loudly, not often, but completely. She wasn't grieving it now. Now she was sitting in a building those men had run for years, with an active federal investigation in her briefcase and 14 personnel files on her desk, and the full authority of her rank behind every question she asked, and in approximately 4 hours she was going to begin pulling this thing apart, piece by piece. Not loudly, not with any visible satisfaction, just with the particular methodical patience of someone who had learned to be very good at the thing they were permitted to do, and who had made the most of every door that opened, and who had been waiting, without ever quite admitting it, even to herself, for exactly this. Her phone buzzed a third time. She turned it over. It wasn't her father. It was a number she didn't recognize, with a Tucson area code. She stared at it for 3 seconds. Then she picked up. She answered on the second ring. "This is Voss." A pause on the other end. Not the pause of a wrong number. The pause of someone who had expected voicemail and was now recalibrating fast. Then a voice, male, young, carrying that specific flatness that people developed when they'd been through something that had taken the color out of ordinary speech. "Vice Admiral Voss." Not a question. He'd known who he was calling. "This is Marcus Ferris?" She sat very still. "Lieutenant Ferris." "Former," he said. "As of 6 weeks ago." "I know. I've read your file." She kept her voice neutral, unhurried. "How did you get this number?" Another pause. "I still have friends at Kellerman." Word travels. A sound that might have been a short, humorless exhale. "I heard you were there, heard something happened this morning on the pier." News moves fast. It always did in that place. He stopped. I wasn't sure you'd pick up. I almost didn't. She turned the chair slightly so she could see out the window. The compound, the far fence line, the strip of silver water beyond. Why are you calling, Lieutenant? Because I filed 2 complaints and nothing happened, and then I got handed a transfer and a handshake and told to be grateful. His voice stayed flat, but there was something under it. Not anger exactly, something more exhausted than anger, something that had been angry for a long time and had run out of heat. And then I heard an IG investigation got opened, and I heard your name attached to it, and I thought... He stopped again. I have documentation. Things I kept. Copies of the original injury reports before they got altered. A recording. The word landed quietly in the room. A recording, she said, from a meeting in September. Commander Solis and 2 of his senior staff discussing how to handle the Reeves incident. I was still on base. I had a phone in my jacket pocket. A beat. I know how that sounds. I know it probably doesn't matter in a formal evidentiary sense, but I wanted someone to hear it who... Where are you right now? Tucson. I've been staying with my sister. She looked at the time. I'm going to give you a number. You call it in the next 30 minutes. You ask for Special Agent Dunlap. You tell her I sent you. She'll take it from there. She read out the number from memory. Do you have that? Yeah. The recording. Don't share it with anyone else until you've spoken with Dunlap. Not former colleagues, not attorneys you haven't vetted. Nobody. She paused. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. All right. She was already reaching for a pen. One more thing. The Reeves incident, that's the one from July? June. The official log has it as July. That's one of the discrepancies. She wrote Reeves/June arrow logged July on the margin of the paper already in front of her. The date shift was small. The date shift was also the kind of thing that could reframe every piece of documentation around it. Thank you for calling, she said. I didn't know if it would matter. It matters, she said. She meant it, and she didn't say it to make him feel better. She said it because it was accurate. Call Dunlap. She hung up. Sat for a moment with the pen still in her hand. Then she pulled the Reeves file from the stack and opened it to the injury date field and looked at it for a long time. June. Not July. In June, Commander Solis had been 30 days out from a major performance review. In July, he'd been past it. The timing of a reportable training injury, the window in which it appeared on the record, could shift a career outcome by degrees that looked small on paper and weren't small at all. She'd seen this before. Not here, not this specific shape, but the underlying logic, the institutional calculus that said a problem that exists before the review is a liability, and a problem that exists after it is just an administrative matter. She'd seen it done to others. She'd had it done to her once, early on, in a different command, in a different branch of the same bureaucracy, and the person who'd done it had retired with full honors and a commendation she still occasionally saw cited in training materials. That particular memory had a specific weight, and she didn't carry it around with her, but she hadn't forgotten it either. She picked up the desk phone and dialed Dunlap's direct line herself. By 1300, the individual sessions were underway in the smaller conference room down the hall. Ames ran the logistics, scheduling men in and out at 30-minute intervals with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd understood, by now, the full scope of what was happening and had made a quiet decision about which side of it she intended to be on. The first 3 sessions were uneventful in the sense that the men who came in said nothing of obvious value while sitting very carefully and constructing each answer with the deliberate architectural precision of people who had talked to lawyers in the last 2 hours. Mara let them build their structures. She asked clean, specific questions and wrote down the answers and kept her face neutral and thanked them for their time. The 4th session was different. Petty Officer 2nd Class Danny Resch was 26, had been at Kellerman for 11 months, and came in carrying the specific tension of someone who had not yet decided what he was going to do. He sat down, looked at the table, looked at her, and then looked at the table again. Petty Officer Resch, she said, I'm going to ask you about the Reeves incident. He nodded slowly. Tell me what you saw. He was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table, and he was looking at them like they were something he'd found and wasn't sure were his. The official log says equipment failure. I know what the log says. Another pause, longer this time. She didn't fill it. It wasn't equipment, he said. His voice was low enough that Ames, across the room, leaned almost imperceptibly forward. Reeves was a third-week trainee. He was having a hard time. And one of the instructors, he stopped, started again. There was physical contact that wasn't in the program. Reeves went down. His wrist was broken in 2 places. He looked up. The instructor told him if he reported it accurately, his performance review would reflect that he was a discipline problem. Did Reeves report it accurately? No, ma'am. Did you? A long pause. He looked back at his hands. I filed an informal concern with my shift supervisor. He told me he'd look into it. A beat. Nothing happened. Who was the instructor? He said the name. She wrote it down. It was a name she'd already underlined in a personnel file that morning, but having it said aloud, on record, by a witness, was something different. It had a different weight. Thank you, she said. I want you to stay on base for the next 72 hours. Don't discuss this conversation with anyone in your chain of command. He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between relief and something she recognized as the specific discomfort of someone who'd kept something to himself too long and had just put it down. Is Reeves going to be all right? She met his eyes. I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. He nodded once and left. Ames closed the door behind him and looked at Mara without speaking. Mara was already writing. Get me Reeves's contact information, she said. Medical discharge location, next of kin, everything in the file. She paused. And find out who the shift supervisor was that Resch reported to. Already pulling it, Ames said quietly. So, at 1500, Captain Hallstrom appeared in the doorway of the conference room with the careful posture of a man who had something to say and was uncertain how it would land. He waited until the current session had ended and the petty officer had left before he came fully in. The phone logs, he said. He set a folder on the table. Solis made 4 calls after the morning briefing. 3 are internal. The 4th, he paused, went to a personal cell number registered to Rear Admiral Holt's Chief of Staff. She opened the folder, looked at the timestamps. The call had lasted 11 minutes, which was long enough to be a substantive conversation and short enough to suggest someone being brief on purpose. Has Solis left the installation? She said. No, he's in his office. Keep it that way. She closed the folder. I don't want him off base without notification to me personally, not for any reason. Hallstrom nodded. He was about to leave, then, Vice Admiral. He said her title like a man choosing it deliberately. I've been the installation commander here for 3 years. I want you to know that I wasn't... He stopped, rearranged. I didn't know the extent of what was happening in Bravo Troop. She looked at him. What did you know? A pause. To his credit, he didn't pretend the question wasn't fair. I knew Solis ran a tight operation. I knew there were tensions with some of the junior staff. I knew Ferris left under circumstances that weren't... He stopped again. I told myself it was a personality conflict. Personality conflicts don't alter injury dates. No, he said, they don't. She held his gaze for a moment. He wasn't a bad man. She'd met enough genuinely bad ones to have a working taxonomy, and he didn't fit it. He was something more common, and in some ways more corrosive. A competent, reasonable man who had looked at something uncomfortable and found a comfortable explanation for it, because uncomfortable explanations created uncomfortable obligations. All right, she said. I appreciate you telling me. He left. She sat in the empty conference room for 2 minutes without picking up a pen or opening a folder, which was something she almost never did and which she permitted herself now because the afternoon was going to be long and the next 72 hours were going to be longer. Then she picked up her phone and texted Ames. Reeves' location. The reply came in 40 seconds. Currently at Kessler Rehabilitation Center, Ridgemont, California. Admitted 3 weeks ago. Orthopedic and psychological. She read it twice. 3 weeks ago was approximately the same time Marcus Ferris had been handed his transfer papers. She didn't know if that was coincidence. She had learned over 30 years to treat coincidences as provisional, not to assume malice immediately, but not to assume absence of malice either. She forwarded the information to Dunlap and added 3 words: priority contact, today. Yeet. At 16:30, she found a quiet corner of the building, a maintenance corridor off the east wing, where foot traffic was sparse and the ambient noise of the base was reduced to a dull mechanical hum. And she called her brother. Garrett Voss was 50 years old and lived in Chesapeake with his wife and 2 teenagers and a career in commercial maritime logistics that he'd built steadily and without much drama over 2 decades. He was not a military man. He'd been aware of this for most of his life, in the way that people were aware of something that had been decided about them before they had opinions about it. Their father had pointed the shape of the family's legacy in one direction, and Garrett had found his own angle on it, and that had worked out all right for everyone. He answered after 2 rings. "Hey." "Hey," she said. "You're in California. How do you know that?" "Dad." She pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose. "What did he say?" "He said he heard you were near Coronado. He said something happened." A pause. "He sounded—" Garrett stopped. "I don't know. Different." "Different how?" "Quieter than usual." He considered that. "He asked me if I thought you were all right." She was quiet for a moment. The maintenance corridor was empty and slightly cold and smelled faintly of industrial solvent. Not an ideal place to have this conversation, but she'd had harder ones in worse locations. "I'm all right," she said. "He wants to call you." "I know, he's been trying." "Mara." Garrett used her name the way he always had, not with particular sentimentality, just with the directness of someone who'd long since given up on indirection with her. "He's 76. He doesn't have infinite time to figure things out." "I know how old he is." "That's not what I—" "Garrett." She stopped him, not harshly. "I'm in the middle of something. I can't have this conversation right now." A pause on his end. "Okay." He didn't push it, which was one of the things she had always appreciated about him. "Are you actually all right?" "Someone threw me in the Pacific this morning." A silence. Then, "What?" "At the pier. A petty officer. He didn't know who I was." "Jesus, Mara." "I'm fine. The water was cold. It's handled." Another silence. Longer. She could hear him processing it, the way he'd always processed the realities of her career, which was to encounter them with a kind of concentrated disbelief, followed by a rapid recalibration to something more practical. "Is the guy—" "It's handled," she said again. "I'll call you from D.C." She hung up and stood in the corridor for another moment. Thought about what Garrett had said. He sounded different. Her father had been a certain kind of man for so long that she'd stopped being able to imagine him as any other kind. The Edmund Voss she carried in her memory was the one who'd stood on the pier in Westbrook Point and told her the limits of her possibilities with the casual authority of someone reciting weather. That man had been 52, her age now. And she realized, standing in a maintenance corridor in Kellerman Naval Station, that she'd never once thought about what it was like to be that man's age and realized you'd been wrong about something for 30 years. She didn't have time to think about it now either. She walked back to the conference room. The last session of the day was Commander Solis. He came in at 17:10, 10 minutes late, which told her something. He'd spent the extra 10 minutes deciding how to present himself, and the version he'd decided on was calmer than the morning, more settled, more prepared, carrying the deliberate composure of a man who had made calls and received assurances and had decided that he understood the shape of the thing he was facing. He was wrong about the shape. She knew that. He didn't know she knew. She let him sit, let him position himself, let him do the thing where he laid his hands on the table with a kind of controlled openness that was supposed to communicate nothing to hide. "Commander," she said, "I want to talk about the Reeves incident." Something in his expression adjusted almost imperceptibly. Not fear. He was too controlled for that to show clearly, but a recalibration. "The June incident was documented, and—" "June," she said. "You said June." He heard it. She watched him hear it. The log said July. Everyone in this building knew the log said July. And he'd just said June, because June was when it happened, and his memory was faster than his caution. He recovered. The incident in question was documented appropriately. The incident in question, she said, took place on June 14th. The injury was logged on July 2nd. The trainee's wrist had 2 fractures consistent with direct impact force. The cause was recorded as a defective safety harness. She looked at him steadily. I want you to explain the gap to me. Administrative processing time, 18 days. Documentation backlogs are, Commander. She kept her voice level, not loud. She'd learned long ago that volume was a tool for people who needed to borrow authority they didn't already have. I have a recording of a meeting in which you and 2 members of your senior staff discussed how to handle the documentation of this incident. I have testimony from a witness who saw the original cause of injury, and I have a statement from a former lieutenant that connects this incident to a retaliatory transfer. She paused. I'm giving you the opportunity to get ahead of this. His composure cracked. Not completely. He held most of it, but a crack, visible at the edges of his jaw and in the shift of his eyes toward the window and back. Whatever you've been told, I've been told quite a bit, she said. I'm asking what you want to tell me. A long silence. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Solis looked at his hands, looked at her, looked at the table. I want to speak with my JAG representative before I say anything further, he said. His voice had changed, flatter now, the performance of confidence gone, what was left underneath more stripped and more real. That's your right, she said. Session suspended. She made a note. For the record, you had the opportunity. He nodded once, stood, and left without looking at her. She sat alone in the conference room for a moment. The November light through the window had gone orange and was fading. Someone had left a half-empty water glass at the far end of the table, and it caught the last of the sun and threw a small oval of light across the surface. She was tired. Her shoulder still ached where she'd hit the water that morning. She hadn't taken anything for it because she'd been moving all day, and the discomfort had been a useful, grounding kind of background noise. She sat with the quiet for exactly 90 seconds. Then she opened the next file. The name at the top was the instructor Resch had named, Chief Petty Officer Ryan Cord. 37 years old, 8 years at Kellerman, 4 commendations, 2 informal grievances, both resolved without action. A fitness report from 3 years ago with a single flagged comment that had been subsequently amended out of the final version. The amendment authorized by Commander Solis. She underlined the name of the person who'd authorized the amendment. Then she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began constructing the timeline from the beginning. Not the official timeline, the real one. Connecting the dates and the names and the decisions in the order they had actually happened, rather than the order they'd been recorded. It took 40 minutes. When she was done, she looked at it. The pattern was clear. Had been clear from the moment Ferris filed his first complaint, and nothing happened. What was in front of her now was just the evidence that named it. The specific institutional machinery of a command that had quietly decided that certain people's accounts of their own injuries didn't matter, and had built a documentation system to make that decision invisible. She thought of Reeves in a rehabilitation center in Ridgemont. 23 years old, wrist fractured in 2 places. Signed a form saying it was a harness failure because someone with authority over his future had told him that telling the truth about what happened to his body was a discipline problem. She picked up her phone and sent Dunlap a second message. Cord, Ryan, CPO, add to scope. The reply came within 3 minutes. Already in. Ferris called. He has audio. We're moving. She read it. Set the phone down. We're moving. She'd built a career on those 2 words, on the understanding that the only direction that mattered was forward, regardless of what was behind you or beside you or looking at you like you didn't belong in the space you were standing in. She had never announced it. She had never needed to. Outside, the base had gone to its evening rhythm, quieter, more deliberate, the compressed intensity of the training day releasing into something slower. She could hear footsteps in the corridor outside, the distant sound of a door closing. She was reaching for the water glass, the abandoned one at the end of the table, not caring whose it was, when Ames knocked and came in with the look she'd come to associate with something unexpected. Ma'am, Ames was holding a printed message. This came through the secure channel from DC 12 minutes ago. Mara took it. She read it once, then again, It was from the office of the Chief of Naval Operations, not Holt's staff. The CNO's office directly, flagged priority, addressed to her by name and rank. The text was 9 sentences long. The second sentence mentioned Commander Solis by name. The fourth sentence mentioned Rear Admiral Holt. The 9th sentence contained a phrase she had not expected to see. Not yet, not this soon, and which changed the scope of what she'd been doing from a command-level inspection to something significantly larger. She lowered the paper and looked at the window. The Pacific was dark now, barely visible, just the suggestion of movement at the edge of the compound lights. The 9th sentence said, "Evidence has emerged suggesting the documentation irregularities at Kellerman may reflect a pattern present across multiple installations within Pacific Fleet Command." Multiple installations. She sat very still. She had come here for Bravo Troop. She had come here for Ferris and Reeves and the falsified dates and the retaliatory transfer and the career of one commander who had decided the rules applied to other people. She had not come here expecting this to be larger than one command. She had not expected, sitting in a cold conference room in Kellerman with a borrowed water glass and 40 minutes of hand-drawn timelines, to be at the beginning of something that went significantly further than where she'd started. She read the 9th sentence a 3rd time. Her shoulder ached. The room was quiet. Ames was watching her with the careful attention of someone waiting for instructions. "Close the door," Mara said. Ames closed it. "Sit down." Ames sat. Mara put the paper on the table between them. "Read the last paragraph." Ames read it. Her expression went through several things in quick succession before it settled on something controlled and alert. "When does the IG investigator arrive?" Mara asked. 71 hours. "Get me Dunlap's direct line. On the secure channel." She was already pulling the timeline she'd drawn toward her. "And I need everything we have on Pacific Fleet's other training installations. Riordan Point, Cape Mallory, Brecon Base. Personnel rosters, injury logs, everything they'll release on a flag request. That'll start now, tonight. I don't care what time it is when it comes through." She looked up. "And Ames." "Ma'am." "Nobody outside this room knows about this message. Not Hallstrom, not anyone on the inspection team. Not your contacts here." She held the lieutenant commander's gaze. "Understood?" "Understood," Ames said. She stood, picked up her notepad, and went for the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "Ma'am," she said, "how big do you think this is?" Mara looked at the timeline on the table in front of her. The names, the dates, the small deliberate alterations that had compounded over months into something that had cost actual people actual pieces of their lives. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what concerns me." Ames nodded once and left. The room was silent. Mara picked up her pen. On the bottom of the timeline, below the last name, she wrote 3 new words. Then she drew a line beneath them, and beneath the line she wrote the name of the first installation, Riordan Point, and began to map what she didn't know yet, but was going to. The water glass caught the overhead light. She finished it in 2 long swallows and set it down empty, and the small sound it made in the quiet room was the only noise for a long time. She wrote the name of Riordan Point and then stopped. Not because she'd run out of things to write. There was plenty left to map, plenty of threads she hadn't pulled yet, but because something in the message was still snagging at her. She went back to it, read the 4th sentence again. Rear Admiral Holt has been placed on administrative hold pending review of communications originating from Kellerman Naval Station on the date of this inspection. Administrative hold. That was fast, faster than she'd expected from a CNO action, and the speed of it told her something she hadn't known an hour ago. This hadn't started with her. She had walked into a process already in motion, which meant someone above her, someone with sight lines she didn't have, had been watching Holt for longer than she'd been watching Solis. She'd been a piece of something she hadn't been told was a chessboard. That bothered her. Not because she minded being useful, that had never been the issue, but because it meant her understanding of the scope was still incomplete, and she was operating in a room where incomplete understanding was a liability. She picked up the secure phone and called Dunlap. Dunlap answered on the first ring, which meant she was awake and at her desk, which at this hour on the East Coast meant she'd been waiting. "You saw the CNO message," Mara said, 20 minutes ago. Dunlap's voice was measured, careful, the voice of a woman who'd spent 15 years in federal investigations and had learned to keep her affect flat when things were moving fast. We're expanding the investigation scope as of tonight. 3 additional installations under preliminary review: Reardon Point, Cape Mallory, and a 3rd site we haven't disclosed publicly yet. Brecon Base. A pause. How did you get there? Pattern recognition. Breccon's injury reporting discrepancies showed up in a Pacific Fleet summary I read in August. Nobody flagged them as significant because each installation looked clean in isolation. She paused. They're not clean in isolation? They're clean because they're in isolation. Dunlap was quiet for a moment. There's something else. The recording Ferris provided. We've had a preliminary authentication on it. It holds up. Another pause. Solis mentions Holt by name, not in a passing way. Mara said nothing. He says, and I'm reading directly, the Admiral knows what the priorities are, and documentation is not going to derail 3 years of operational standing. End quote. Dunlap let that sit. Ferris recorded that in September. That's 60 days before Holt's name appeared in any of our internal flags. 60 days. Which meant Solis had been making those calls for at least that long, with the understanding that the call would be received and the message understood and the protection would hold. It had held until it hadn't. What do you need from me before your investigator arrives? Mara said. The individual session transcripts. And one more thing. Dunlap's tone shifted slightly. Not softer, but more precise. The way people sounded when they were about to ask for something they weren't sure they'd get. Reeves. We need a formal statement from him. Medical facility access, direct testimony, the works. His current status is complicated because he's separated under a general discharge rather than medical. Whoever processed his paperwork made sure the injury cause on file matched the falsified log. That affects his benefits, his record, everything. Mara closed her eyes briefly. She'd understood this was likely. Understanding something likely and hearing it confirmed at 1900 hours after a day that had started with 47-degree water were different experiences. I'll authorize the facility access tonight, she said. Dunlap, when you talk to him, be careful. He's 23 and he's been told twice that telling the truth about what happened to him was the wrong decision. He's going to need to believe this time is different. Noted. Make it true. She hung up. At 2015, Mara was standing in the small office with a topographic printout of Pacific Fleet installations spread across the desk. Not a digital map, an actual paper printout she'd had Ames pull from the base planning archives because she thought better with paper, and she didn't particularly care who knew that. When the door opened without a knock, she looked up. Captain Hallstrom. Behind him, a man she didn't recognize, civilian suit, mid-50s, carrying a leather briefcase with the particular worn quality of someone who'd carried the same case for 20 years because it worked, and aesthetics weren't the point. Vice Admiral, Hallstrom said. His face was carefully neutral in a way that meant he wasn't happy about whatever he was about to say. This is Mr. Aldrich Bowen. He's JAG-affiliated counsel representing Commander Solis. Bowen extended a hand. She shook it once. His grip was practiced, dry, professional. Vice Admiral Voss, he said, I apologize for the hour. What can I do for you, Mr. Bowen? He set the briefcase on the chair beside the door, opened it, and retrieved a document of perhaps 12 pages. He placed it on the desk in front of her with the deliberate care of someone who understood that paper had weight. Commander Solis is prepared to cooperate fully with the investigation, he said, in exchange for a formal agreement that his cooperation be considered in the sentencing and career action phases of any subsequent proceedings. He paused. He has information that extends beyond his own command. Information he believes the IG investigation doesn't yet have. She looked at the document without picking it up. What kind of information? Specific, documented, related to the authorization chain above his rank. Bowen kept his voice neutral. Commander Solis did not act unilaterally. He received direction. He kept records of that direction. Not complete records, but enough to establish that the decisions made at Kellerman were not originated at Kellerman. She looked at Bowen. Holt? Bowen didn't confirm or deny. He simply maintained the specific stillness of a man who knew when to let silence carry the weight. Mr. Bowen, she said, I don't negotiate investigative agreements. That's not my function here. What I can do is make sure this document reaches Special Agent Dunlap's desk tonight, and she can assess whether a cooperation agreement falls within the IG's current framework. She picked up the document. Is your client prepared to provide an initial evidentiary proffer without an agreement in place? Bowen considered that. He'd be willing to provide a preliminary statement, off record. Nothing in this building is off record. A pause. Understood. He closed the briefcase. I'll be available until 2200. I'll have Dunlap's office contact you within the hour. Bowen nodded, retrieved his case, and left. Hallstrom stayed standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides. Captain, she said, did you know Bowen was coming? He arrived at the gate 40 minutes ago. I called ahead. Hallstrom met her gaze. I thought you should have the time to prepare. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you. He nodded and left. She picked up the phone and called Dunlap again. Dunlap listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, there was a brief silence on the line. He kept records, Dunlap said, not a question. That's what Bowen says. If Solis documented the authorization chain, then we're not talking about a command-level misconduct case, Mara said. We're talking about something structural. Dunlap's exhale was quiet. How many people does structural touch? At minimum, everyone in Holt's reporting chain who knew and didn't act. At maximum, she stopped. I don't know yet. Neither do you. That's why we need the proffer. I'll call Bowen myself. A pause. Mara. Dunlap never used her first name. Mara registered it. How are you holding up? I'm fine. You went in the water this morning. I've been wetter. She said it flatly. Call Bowen. She hung up and stood at the desk for a moment, looking at the paper map. Pacific Fleet installations, so? 7 major, 11 secondary, spread along 3,000 miles of coastline and beyond. Riordan Point, Cape Mallory, Brecon. And behind those names, other names, the names of people who'd been where Reeves was, 22 or 23, and told that what happened to their body was an administrative matter, that the record was the record, that the choice between their account and the official account had already been made for them. She pressed both hands flat on the map, just for a moment. Not for drama. She was alone in the room, but because some part of her needed the physical contact with something concrete. Then she straightened up and kept working. Tiam, at 22:20, Ames came back in with a printout she'd been waiting for. The initial data pull from Riordan Point's injury logs, routed through a flag-level access request Mara had filed 2 hours earlier. The pull was incomplete, just the last 14 months, just the flagged categories. But it was enough. She spread it beside the Kellerman documentation and looked at both simultaneously. The pattern wasn't identical. It wasn't supposed to be identical. Identical patterns were the mark of a single person's habits, and what she was looking at wasn't one person. It was a method. The same general architecture applied with different specific techniques, adapted to different installation cultures, signed off by different supervisors who all sat within the same reporting structure. 7 discrepancies at Riordan Point in 14 months. 6 of them bore the same class of alteration as Kellerman's, cause of injury reclassification, date adjustments within a narrow band, medical notes superseded by administrative corrections. The 7th was different. The 7th was a trainee who had formally appealed his discharge documentation and been denied. The denial signed by an officer who, according to the Kellerman personnel files, had served under Holt for 4 years before lateral transfer. She wrote that officer's name on a separate sheet of paper. She was about to reach for the Cape Mallory pull when Ames's phone rang across the room. Ames answered it, listened for under 10 seconds, and then her face did something that made Mara look up fully. Give me a second, Ames said into the phone. She lowered it. Ma'am, it's the gate. What is it? Petty Officer Reeves is here. Ames's voice was careful. At the main gate. On foot. Mara went very still. Reeves is in Ridgemont. He's at Kessler. He discharged himself this afternoon. Apparently he heard from someone that the investigation was active, that there was a federal agent asking about him. Ames paused. He drove 4 hours. She was already moving. Bring him in. Medical evaluation first. He had orthopedic injuries. Find out if he needs anything. And Ames, she stopped at the door. Nobody talks to him until I do. They put Reeves in one of the smaller offices near the east entrance, a spare room with 2 chairs and a table and a window that looked onto a floodlit section of the compound. He was sitting when she came in, hands wrapped around a paper cup of something that might have been coffee or might have been bad tea, and he was 23 years old, and he looked like he'd driven 4 hours without sleeping the night before, which was probably because he had. His right wrist was wrapped in a soft brace. The fracture had been surgical. She'd read the notes. 2 pins, partial mobility recovery, physical therapy ongoing or recently suspended. He'd driven 4 hours with that wrist. She sat across from him. He looked at her with the specific wariness of someone who'd been told twice that telling the truth was the wrong decision, and she understood that the first thing she needed to do was not explain herself or reassure him, because explanation and reassurance from authority figures had been the mechanism of his injury, and he'd know that before she finished the sentence. So she said, "You drove 4 hours." "Yes, ma'am." "Why?" He looked at the cup. "Because someone called me from the IG's office. A woman named Dunlap. She told me—" He stopped. "She told me that what's in my discharge record isn't accurate, that there's documentation that doesn't match." He looked up. "I already knew that. I signed the form anyway. That's the part I—" He stopped again. She didn't fill the silence. "I signed it," he said. "I signed the form that said it was the harness. Nobody made me sign it. I mean," he pressed his lips together. "Chief Cord told me what would happen if I didn't. He was pretty specific about it, but nobody held my hand. I signed it." "You were 22 years old," she said. "You had 2 fractures and a superior officer telling you that the alternative to signing was a discipline flag that would end your career. It doesn't excuse it," she said. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's context, and context matters to the record." She looked at him steadily. "The form you signed was obtained under coercion. The law has a definition for that. It is not the same as signing freely." He sat with that. "What happens now?" he said. His voice was young in a way that had nothing to do with age. It was the voice of someone asking a question they didn't really believe would get a straight answer. "Now you give a formal statement. Dunlap's investigator will be here in 2 days. In the meantime, we keep you on base. We get your wrist looked at by our medical officer. Don't argue with me about that. And we start the process of correcting your discharge record." She paused. "It will take time. It will not be straightforward. The process for correcting documentation at this level involves multiple steps, and I'm not going to tell you it's simple because it isn't." He nodded, a small nod. But he was still looking at her, and the wariness had shifted slightly. Not gone, but layered over with something more tentative. "Ma'am," he said, "the woman who threw the thing on the pier this morning." He stopped. "That was you?" "Yes." "I heard about it." He looked at the table. "I heard you just walked out of the water and ran the inspection anyway." She said nothing. "I didn't know officers like that existed," he said. It came out without performance, like he hadn't decided to say it. It had just come out. She stood. "Get your wrist looked at. Someone will bring you something to eat." She moved toward the door. "And Reeves." She stopped without turning fully. "What happened to you was not the result of your weakness. It was the result of a system that calculated that your silence was worth more to it than your welfare." A pause. "That calculation was wrong. We're going to prove that on paper." She left him sitting with the paper cup and walked back into the corridor, and for a moment she stood against the wall in the empty hallway and let herself be still for exactly 10 seconds. Not composure. She was composed. Something smaller. Just the act of acknowledging, privately, that this was the part of the work that cost something, and that the cost was appropriate, and that she was going to keep going anyway. 10 seconds. Then she walked back to the office. It was nearly midnight when Dunlap's text came through. Bowen delivered the proffer. Solis had everything in writing. Holt directed the documentation protocol across 4 installations starting 3 years ago. We have chain emails. We have a memo with Holt's signature. She read it 3 times, a signed memo. Not a verbal direction, not an implied understanding or an institutional culture that could be argued as ambient pressure. A signed memo, which meant Holt had believed himself protected enough to put his name on it, which meant someone above Holt had also understood the shape of what was being built and had decided to let it exist. She was about to send a reply when a second message came through, not from Dunlap, from a number she didn't recognize. No area code identifier, just a message, 6 words long. We need to talk. Tonight, secure. She stared at it. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She didn't respond. She put the phone down, picked up the secure desk unit, and ran a trace request on the number through the base communications officer, routing it with a priority flag that would get a response in under 20 minutes. While she waited, she looked at the map. 7 major installations, 11 secondary, a signed memo from a rear admiral, a cooperation agreement taking shape in a JAG office at midnight, a 23-year-old in a room 2 corridors away with a wrist in a brace, and a discharge record that was going to have to be rebuilt from the ground up. And an unidentified number, no area code, 6 words, asking for a secure line at midnight. The trace result came back in 17 minutes. She looked at it, read the registered origin point, set the paper down very carefully on the desk. The number was registered to a communications office in Washington, D.C., not the JAG office, not the IG, not any of the offices currently part of this investigation. It was registered to the office of the Chief of Naval Operations. She picked up the secure desk unit and dialed the number back. It rang twice. Vice Admiral Voss? The voice was male, older, with the unhurried cadence of someone who slept well and expected to continue doing so. Thank you for calling back. Who am I speaking with? My name is Whitmore. I'm a senior aide to Admiral Calloway. A pause. Not uncertain, strategic. You received the CNO's message this evening. I did. Admiral Calloway would like to speak with you directly. Tomorrow morning, 700, secure video link. He's been briefed on the full scope of the investigation, and he has some things he wants to say to you personally before the IG team arrives. She processed that. The CNO wanted a direct call before the investigators landed, before the formal process, before the documentation was sealed, before the institutional machinery took over and removed the possibility of anything informal passing between them. That could mean several things. She chose not to decide which one it meant until she was in the room. Oh, 700 works, she said. Good. The link will come through the base secure comm system. You'll want a private terminal. I'll arrange it. One more thing, Vice Admiral. Whitmore's voice shifted slightly. Not warmer, but more deliberate. Admiral Calloway asked me to tell you specifically that what happened this morning on the pier will be addressed at the appropriate level. He said you'd know what that means. She wasn't sure she did, but she said, understood, because the conversation was over and prolonging it served nothing. She put the phone down and looked at the map for a long moment. Then she went to find somewhere to sleep. The base had guest quarters in a building adjacent to the administrative block. 8 rooms, utilitarian, the kind of space that communicated temporary in every surface. She'd slept in worse. She'd slept in significantly worse, in locations that didn't have beds or running water or a ceiling that wasn't canvas, and the perspective that provided was occasionally useful. She set an alarm for 600, lay down on top of the blankets still dressed, and stared at the ceiling for approximately 4 minutes before she was asleep. She dreamed about the pier, not the fall. The moment before it, standing at the end of the concrete with the Pacific below her, looking at the water. In the dream, she wasn't sure she was going to fall. In the dream, she was just standing there, and the water was the color it had been that morning, old iron and moving, and she was 21 years old and 52 years old at the same time. And her father was somewhere behind her, not close enough to hear. She woke at 5:47. Lay still for a moment. Got up. Admiral Calloway appeared on the secure screen at 0703, which was 2 minutes late and which she chose to read as a man managing a morning schedule rather than a statement. He was 64, dark-skinned, silver at the temples, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades learning to conserve physical energy for the moments when it mattered. He'd been CNO for 14 months. She'd met him twice in formal settings and had formed no strong impression either time, which she'd taken as neutral information. Vice Admiral Voss, he said. Admiral. He looked at her for a moment. You look like you slept in your uniform. I did. Something moved at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile. All right, let me be direct with you. He leaned forward slightly. The Holt situation has been developing for 8 months. We've had an internal flag on his communication patterns going back to last spring. Irregular channels, contact with personnel under investigation, pressure applied to IG timelines in ways that were technically within his authority and practically problematic. He paused. We needed a catalyst, something that would force the documentation into the open fast enough that the response apparatus couldn't manage it. She understood before he finished the sentence. She let him finish anyway. The inspection at Kellerman was your idea, Calloway said. Yours, filed through proper channels 6 weeks ago, approved by my office 12 days after that. I didn't engineer your presence there. What I did do was make sure that when the inspection triggered a response from Holt, because we knew it would, we were positioned to capture it. He met her gaze through the screen. You were not misled about the nature of your assignment, but I want you to understand the full picture. She held his gaze. The call Solis made to Holt's chief of staff was logged and recorded within the hour. Yes. And the administrative hold on Holt went into effect the moment the call content was reviewed. He paused. Bowen's proffer last night. Solis had more than we expected. The memo alone gives us enough to proceed at the flag officer level, which is a different process with different oversight requirements and significantly higher institutional stakes. How high? Calloway was quiet for a moment. Holt is not the top of the chain. She absorbed that. There's a civilian-contractor interface, Calloway continued. Procurement. 3 training equipment contracts that have been routed through installations under Holt's oversight for the past 4 years. The documentation irregularities, the injury reclassifications, they weren't just about protecting careers. They were about protecting a procurement record. If training injuries are caused by instructor conduct rather than equipment failure, the equipment is not defective. If the equipment is not defective, the contracts continue. If the contracts continue, he stopped. You see the shape of it. She saw the shape of it. The falsified injury records weren't only about keeping operators out of trouble. They were the foundation of a financial argument. Every injury logged as equipment failure was evidence that the equipment needed to exist, needed to be replaced, needed to be purchased again under the same contracts from the same vendors. And somewhere in that procurement chain, someone was receiving something for making sure the argument held. Who's the contractor? She said. I can't give you that yet. It's outside the military investigative jurisdiction. FBI is coordinating. But it's relevant because it means what you found at Kellerman isn't the end of this. It's the documentation layer of something that goes further. She put both hands flat on the desk, looked at them for a moment. What do you need from me? Your inspection findings, formally filed by 1700 today, your individual session transcripts, and, he paused, I'd like you to remain at Kellerman when the IG team arrives, not as the officer who initiated the inspection, as the senior officer on scene for the duration of the formal process. She looked at the screen. That puts me here for another week minimum. At least. I had 2 other assignments, reassigned. He said it without apology, but also without dismissiveness. This matters more. And frankly, Voss, you've already pulled more out of this installation in 18 hours than the preliminary team flagged in 4 months of remote review. Another pause. You have a way of finding things. She said nothing for a moment, then, Reeves, the trainee, his discharge record needs to be corrected and his medical benefits reinstated retroactively. That's not something that waits for the investigation timeline. Agreed, I'll have it initiated today. And Ferris, the transfer notation in his file that implies disciplinary cause, also agreed, both of them. She nodded once. Then I'll stay. Calloway looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something between assessment and something older than assessment. I reviewed your service record last week, he said. The full record, not the summary. She waited. 30 years, he said. The Middle East deployments, the intelligence coordination work, the Hartwell mission. He named the last one specifically, and she felt the name land in the room with its actual weight. Hartwell was classified at a level that meant Calloway had gone out of his way to access it. I want you to know that I'm aware of what you've done and where you've done it, and I'm aware that awareness came late. She held his gaze. It came when it came, Admiral. Yes, he said. It did. He straightened. I'll be in contact after the IG team arrives. Keep Dunlap informed in real time. The screen went dark. She sat in the empty communications room for a moment. The Hartwell mission hadn't been discussed in any formal setting in 11 years. She hadn't expected to hear the name spoken aloud by a CNO who'd looked it up specifically, and she wasn't sure yet what to do with the fact that he had. She picked up her notes and went back to work. The IG investigators arrived not in 72 hours, but in 41. Two of them, Dunlap herself, which surprised Mara slightly, and a younger agent named Prescott who carried 3 tablets and said very little and wrote everything down. They set up in the largest conference room and began their formal process with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before and had learned to move faster than the institutions they were investigating. Mara gave them the morning. She briefed them on her findings in sequence: the Reeves incident, the date discrepancies, the Solis session, the Ferris recording, the Reardon point poll, the CNO communication. She laid it out without editorializing, without emphasis on what had happened to her personally, because what had happened to her personally was not the point, and had never been the point. Dunlap listened and took notes and asked clean, specific questions, the same way Mara ran sessions. At the end, Dunlap said, "Crawl." "Yes." "Well, we need him formally interviewed. What he did to you this morning it's relevant, not just as an incident. It's evidence of command culture. A petty officer doesn't physically remove a flag officer from a restricted pier unless he has a very particular understanding of what is and isn't permitted in his environment." Mara had known this was coming. She'd known it and had spent the night deciding how she felt about it, which was a separate process from what needed to happen. "I'll authorize the interview," she said. "I won't participate in it." Dunlap looked at her. "You're the witness." "I know. I'll provide a written statement. The interview is yours." She paused. "I've been doing this long enough to know that when the person who was harmed is also the senior officer running the process, the thing that matters most is that the process is clean. My participation in his interview compromises the clean." Dunlap considered that. "All right. But," Mara held her gaze, "don't let institutional courtesy soften the questions. What he did was physical. It was deliberate. And it happened because someone in that command communicated explicitly or by example that certain people in certain spaces could be handled that way." "Understood," Dunlap said. "We won't soften it." The formal interviews began that afternoon. Mara stayed out of the conference room and worked from the small office, cross-referencing the Reardon Point and Cape Mallory documentation against the Kellerman timeline. The pattern at Cape Mallory was the clearest of the 3. 9 injury reclassifications in 14 months, all within the same instructor cadre, all signed off by a supervisor who had been transferred to Kellerman 6 months ago and whose name was already on Mara's separate list. At 14:30, Prescott knocked and came in with a printout. He set it on the desk without comment and left, which was efficient and which she appreciated. It was Krall's preliminary interview transcript, 37 pages. She read it in 11 minutes. Krall had been cooperative in the specific way that people were cooperative when they understood that cooperation was their only remaining asset. He'd answered the questions directly, without trying to minimize the physical act itself, a tactical decision, probably advised, and had focused instead on context. He'd received informal guidance from Chief Cord on 3 separate occasions about managing civilian intrusions on training facilities. He'd been told that base access cards were sometimes provided to observers and that observers were to be redirected firmly. He'd been told, specifically, that the morning PT Pier was a zero-tolerance space and that any non-training personnel found there during active hours were to be removed immediately. He hadn't been told how to remove them. He'd filled that gap himself. She set the transcript down. Chief Cord. The same name Resch had given her. The same name whose personnel file showed a fitness report amendment authorized by Solis. The thread was consistent and it ran straight, and it was the kind of straight that only existed when something had been organized, not when it had grown organically. She added Cord's name to a formal referral and sent it to Dunlap's terminal. At 16:15, Commander Solis was escorted from his office to the conference room for his formal IG interview. Mara watched him cross the compound from the window, not with satisfaction, not with particular feeling. He walked with his hands at his sides and his chin at a controlled angle, and he was managing his posture the way he'd been managing everything since yesterday morning, which was with the discipline of a man who understood that the performance of composure was the last thing he had any control over. She turned back to the desk. The formal interview with Solis lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. Mara knew this because Dunlap told her afterward, standing in the corridor with her jacket off, and her collar loosened in the particular state of controlled exhaustion that 4-hour interviews produced. "He gave us everything," Dunlap said. "All of it. The memo, the emails, 3 additional communications he hadn't included in the proffer. There's a handwritten note from Holt, actual handwriting, dated, directing the documentation protocol for Kellerman specifically." She paused. "He had it photographed and stored off base in a safety deposit box in San Diego." Mara looked at her. "He was protecting himself. For 2 years. He knew at some level that this was going to catch up eventually, and he built a fallback position." Dunlap's expression was the specific flat affect of someone who'd heard everything and had stopped being surprised by any of it. "He's not a complicated man. He just had the instinct to hedge." The handwritten note changes the nature of Holt's exposure significantly. This is no longer, "I was following institutional culture." This is documented, personalized direction to falsify federal training records. Dunlap looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. "Holt's attorney filed a response to the administrative hold this afternoon. He's contesting jurisdiction." "He won't win that." "No, but it slows the formal action by a few days while the jurisdictional question is resolved." Dunlap paused. "I want to be honest with you. Holt has institutional relationships that Solis doesn't have. There will be pressure applied at levels above this investigation. It may slow things." "It will slow things," Mara said. "It won't stop them." Dunlap looked at her for a moment. "You're very certain?" "Because I've read the memo and I've seen the handwriting and I know what a signed document does to a flag officer's institutional protection. It removes it." She paused. "His relationships will make the process uncomfortable. The document makes the outcome fixed." Dunlap was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "We're going to need your formal inspection report filed by end of day tomorrow. All 7 findings, all documentation, countersigned. It'll be done by morning." Dunlap started back toward the conference room, then stopped. "Reeves gave his formal statement this afternoon. She considered her words. He was very precise, very clear about the sequence of events and about the coercive conversation with Cord. He didn't minimize, didn't embellish, he just told it." A pause. "He asked if you would be informed." "Tell him I will be." Dunlap nodded and went back to work. Ishko. At 1900 that evening, Edmund Voss called. She was in the small office halfway through the formal report, and she looked at the name on her personal phone for a long moment before she answered, partly because she was tired, partly because she'd been thinking about Garrett's words. He sounded different, and the specific quality of different that she'd been carrying since the day before. "Dad," she said. A silence on the line. Not uncomfortable. Edmund Voss had never been uncomfortable with silence, had used it the way some people used words, deliberately and with intention. "Mara." His voice was lower than she remembered. Not weaker. Her father had never sounded weak. It wasn't a register available to him, but lower, like something that had been held at a certain pitch for a long time and had settled. "I'm in the middle of something," she said. "I know. I won't keep you long." A pause. "I heard about the Pier." "News still travels?" "Always did." Another pause. "Are you all right?" She noticed he didn't ask what happened or who did it or what was being done about it. He asked if she was all right, which was a different question, and it arrived in her chest with a weight she hadn't anticipated. "I'm all right," she said. "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "I saw something. On the secure news feed, the administrative hold on Holt, they listed you as the senior officer on scene of the investigation. Yes. 4 installations, he said. Pacific Fleet. Yes. A long silence. She could hear his breathing on the other end, slow and deliberate, the breathing of a man who is choosing something. I want you to know, he said, that I am... He stopped, started again. I've been trying to figure out how to say this for longer than I should have needed. Another stop. I made an assumption about you, a long time ago, and I held it long after it should have been obvious to me that I was wrong, and I didn't... His voice shifted slightly. I didn't say so. She was quiet. I don't know what I expected, he said, that you'd argue with me more, maybe, make me see it. You never did. No, she said. I didn't. You just kept going. That's all I knew how to do. He was quiet again. She could hear something in the background. A television, maybe, or wind against a window. The ambient sound of a house that an old man moved through alone. I've been watching the thing with Kellerman, he said, the way you moved through it. Someone told me about the briefing session, Solus. A pause. He said you came in there knowing everything before anyone said a word and you just laid it out, without raising your voice. She said nothing. That's not something they teach, he said. That's something a person has or they don't. Dad. She stopped herself, started again. I'm glad you called. I have to get back to the report. I know. He paused once more. I'm proud of you. I should have said that a long time ago, and I didn't, and I'm saying it now. The words landed in the room and she sat with them and didn't say anything for a moment because there wasn't an immediate response that was both true and adequately simple. I know, she said finally. I'll call you from D.C. She hung up, sat with both hands on the desk. The report was open in front of her. 7 findings, pages of documentation, the dry institutional language that would carry these facts into formal record and begin the process of making them permanent. She picked up the pen. She wasn't going to be able to think about the phone call until she was somewhere that wasn't this room, and this room had several more hours of work left in it, so she put it in the back of her mind in the specific way she'd learned to put things when they needed to wait, and she started writing. The formal report was filed at 0237. At 0900 the following morning, Rear Admiral Holt's attorney withdrew the jurisdictional challenge. The withdrawal had no public explanation attached to it, but Dunlap forwarded Mara a brief note at 0912 that said simply, his legal team read the memo. At 1100, Holt was formally relieved of command pending the outcome of the IG investigation. The action was announced through standard military channels with the specific language that meant the outcome was not expected to be favorable. Pending investigation in that context was not a holding pattern, it was a first step. Mara read the announcement on her phone while walking between buildings. She didn't stop walking. At 1345, Chief Petty Officer Ryan Cord was brought in for formal interview. She wasn't in the room. She was in the office, working through the Cape Mallory documentation, and she heard through Ames that the interview ran 2 hours and that Cord had declined cooperation, which was his right, and which, given the volume of corroborating testimony and documentation already on record, was also not going to significantly alter the outcome. At 1530, Petty Officer Darren Krall received formal notice that he was being removed from active training duty, pending the outcome of a formal review board. The notice cited the Pier incident specifically, by date and time, and a description that did not soften the physical nature of what he'd done. Ames told her this also. She acknowledged it and went back to the Cape Mallory file. At 1700, she took 20 minutes and walked to the room where Reeves was staying. He was sitting on the edge of the bed in the guest quarters, reading something on his phone. He stood when she came in, straightened automatically, and she waved him back down. She sat in the chair across from him. Your discharge record is being corrected, she said. Medical benefits reinstated, retroactive to the date of injury. The processing will take several weeks. That's the system, not negligence. But it's been initiated at the CNO level, which means it won't get stuck. He nodded. He looked like he'd slept, which was something. And the record itself? What it says about why I left? The cause of separation will be corrected to medical discharge with full documentation of the injury and its cause. The coercive conversation with Cord will be part of the supplemental record. She paused. That means anyone who accesses your service history will see an accurate account. He looked at the floor. I don't know if I'm going to re-enlist. That's not a decision you have to make now. No. He looked up. But if I do, if I wanted to, would it? Your record, once corrected, will not be an obstacle. She held his gaze. I can't promise you what the path looks like after that. What I can tell you is that the record will be clean. He nodded again. Something in him had settled in the past 36 hours. Not resolved, there was still too much for full resolution, but settled in the way of someone who had stopped bracing for the ground to disappear and had found it solid under their feet. Thank you, he said, for I know this is your job, but thank you. It's my job, she said, and it matters. She stood. Eat something. He almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. At 2100, Dunlap called. The contractor, she said without preamble. FBI briefed us this evening. The procurement contracts, equipment supply across 4 Pacific Fleet installations, are held by a firm called Carrick Defense Solutions, privately held, incorporated in Delaware, operated out of a Phoenix address that traces to a shell company. A pause. The individual who holds the primary ownership stake through the shell structure has a prior professional relationship with Rear Admiral Holt dating back 14 years. They served together, stayed in contact. Mara sat down. What's his name? Her name, Dunlap said. Greta Sana, former Navy 04, separated in 2009. Built the company from a small equipment consultancy into a $15 million federal contractor over 10 years. Another pause. FBI has been building a case on Carrick for 6 months. They didn't know about the injury falsification connection until Ferris's recording surfaced. That recording puts Holt in a conversation where the documentation protocol is explicitly linked to protecting equipment performance records, a beat, which protects Sana's contracts. So the recording isn't just evidence of command misconduct, Mara said. It's evidence of a federal contracting fraud scheme. Yes. Dunlap's voice was measured, but the weight under it was not. This is not a military investigation anymore. It's a joint federal case. Mara was quiet for a moment. Reeves, she said. Ferris, the trainees at Riordan and Cape Mallory. Their injuries and their falsified records, they were the accounting fiction that kept a $15 million contract alive. That's what it looks like. She sat with that for a moment. The full geometry of it, what had started on a pier in the dark, in 47-degree water, with a petty officer who thought he was removing an inconvenience, had roots that went back years, through a retired officer's company and a flag officer's deliberate choices, and the specific institutional weight of documentation that said the equipment failed, not the people again and again, until it had cost enough people enough that someone finally came to look. What do you need from me? She said. Your formal testimony. On record, to the FBI case agent within the next 48 hours. The Pier incident is part of the evidentiary picture. It demonstrates the operational culture at the installation level, which connects to Cord, which connects to Solis, which connects to Holt. Dunlap paused. You're not just the investigating officer anymore, Mara. You're a witness in a federal fraud case. She said nothing. I know that's not what you signed up for when you filed the inspection request. It doesn't matter what I signed up for, she said. I'll do the testimony. Good. Another pause. There's something else. A reporter from the Pacific Tribune called the base public affairs office this afternoon. They're asking about the Holt administrative hold and about, specifically, an incident on the Kellerman training pier involving a flag officer. The words landed quietly. Someone leaked, Mara said. We don't know who yet. The story isn't filed. They're still reporting. But it's going to be filed, and when it is, it'll name you. She closed her eyes briefly. Not in distress. She'd known this was a possible shape of things, had known since the morning it happened that an incident of that kind at that level would eventually reach the press. She'd just hoped for more time. When? Our contact at the Tribune says they're targeting tomorrow's digital edition. A pause. Public Affairs can request a delay for national security reasons, which would buy maybe 24 hours. But the story is going to run. She opened her eyes. Don't delay it. A silence. If we delay it, she said, it looks like suppression. If it runs on its own timeline, it runs on its own timeline. She paused. Make sure the public affairs statement is accurate, not extensive. Accurate. What happened, when it happened, what actions were taken. Nothing beyond that. All right, Dunlap said. And make sure Reeves knows before it runs. He shouldn't read about himself in a news story. I'll tell him tonight. After she hung up, the room was quiet. She sat in the chair and looked at the ceiling, which was institutional white and had a small water stain in the upper left corner that she'd been peripherally aware of for 2 days. 30 years. She'd spent 30 years keeping her work inside the architecture of the institution, visible only to the people with the clearance to look. She'd been deliberate about that, not from lack of confidence, but from the specific understanding that the work mattered more than the story of the work, and that visibility without substance was a currency she'd never had much use for. The story of the work was about to become visible. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. She was reaching for her phone to check the latest documentation pull from Cape Mallory when the secure terminal on the desk chimed with an incoming flagged message. She leaned forward. Read the sender designation. It wasn't from Dunlap. It wasn't from Calloway's office. It wasn't from any of the nodes she'd been communicating with for the past 2 days. The sender designation was the Inspector General's Washington office, the central office, not the field team. And the message was flagged at a classification level she hadn't seen used in this investigation. She opened it. Read it once. The message was 11 lines long. The first 3 lines acknowledged the Kellerman investigation findings. The 4th line referenced the Holt administrative action. The 5th through 8th lines described the Carrick Defense Solutions contracting structure in terms that were more specific than anything Dunlap had given her, which meant the IG's central office had been running a parallel track she hadn't known about. The 9th line said, a secondary procurement relationship has been identified linking Carrick Defense Solutions to equipment supply contracts at 2 installations outside Pacific Fleet Command. The 10th line listed the installations. The 11th line said, one of these installations is Westbrook Point Naval Annex, Virginia. Current commanding officer, Rear Admiral Edmund Voss, retired, serving as installation advisor under a civilian contract renewed annually since 2018. She read the 11th line again. Her father's name, her father's installation, her father's contract. The room was very quiet. She sat in it. Her father had spent 9 years as a retired civilian advisor to Westbrook Point, the installation where she'd grown up, where he'd told her what she was and wasn't capable of. The pier she'd been thinking about since the morning she'd walked to the end of Kellerman's concrete dock. Carrick Defense Solutions supplied equipment to Westbrook Point. Her father had been renewing a civilian advisory contract with that installation every year since 2018. The message did not say he knew. It did not say he was complicit. It said a secondary procurement relationship had been identified and that his name was attached to that installation by virtue of his advisory role. She sat with both hands flat on the desk. In the morning, she was going to have to call him back. She didn't sleep again that night. She didn't try. She sat at the desk and worked through the Cape Mallory documentation because the work was there, and the alternative was sitting with her hands in her lap thinking about her father's name on a federal investigative document, which was something she'd been trained by circumstance, if not by instruction, to defer until she had more information. Emotion without information was just pressure, and pressure without direction destroyed things. She had the Cape Mallory files cross-referenced and annotated by 0400. She had the Brecon Base summary reviewed by 0530. At 0615, she made coffee in the break room down the hall and stood at the window while it was still dark outside and let herself think about it for 10 minutes, cleanly and without flinching. Her father's advisory contract with Westbrook Point had been renewed annually since 2018. Carrick Defense Solutions had held equipment supply contracts at Westbrook Point since 2019. Those 2 facts existed in the same document. They were not, by themselves, evidence of anything. A civilian advisor and a defense contractor occupying the same installation was not unusual. It was the standard architecture of how retired military personnel often intersected with procurement in their post-service roles. And most of the time, it was exactly what it appeared to be: proximity, not conspiracy. But Greta Sana had served under Holt, and Holt had known her father. And her father had served in the same community, the same generation, the same tight web of professional relationships that the naval special warfare world had always been. She didn't know if he knew. She didn't know if knowing was the right word for whatever shape it might take. She knew that the IG's central office had flagged it, and that flagging was not accusation, and that she needed to handle this with the same precision she'd applied to every other piece of this, which meant she needed to call him before the investigators did. At 700, she picked up her personal phone and called him. He answered after one ring, which meant he'd been awake. "I need to ask you something," she said without preamble. "All right." "Carrick Defense Solutions. Do you know the company?" A pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Not long, but present. "They supply equipment to Westbrook Point, safety harnesses, climbing gear, some tactical training hardware. They've been on contract since..." He stopped. "Since around 2019, I think. Maybe earlier." "Do you know Greta Sana?" Another pause, this one longer. "I knew a Greta Sana when she was a lieutenant. She served at Coronado under Holt, maybe 2006, 2007. We overlapped at a conference or two after that." A beat. "I haven't spoken to her in years. Why?" She told him. Not everything. The contracting fraud, the procurement scheme, the chain from Sane to Holt to the falsified injury records. She gave him the structure. She kept her voice even, and she didn't editorialize, and she listened to the silence on the other end while she did it. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was flat, not defensive, flat in the way things went flat when something landed with real weight. "I reviewed the equipment contracts in 2020 as part of my advisory scope. They look standard. I didn't have reason to..." He stopped. "I didn't look deeper. The IG's Washington office flagged your name because of the advisory role. That's procedural. It's not accusation." "I understand what it is, Mara." "I know you do." She paused. "You're going to receive a contact from their office within 48 hours, probably sooner. I wanted you to know before they called." A silence. "Your brother is going to hear about this," he said. "Yes." "And the Navy." "Yes." She paused. "What you know and when you knew it and what you did with it, that's what the record will show. If the answer is that you reviewed the contracts, found nothing irregular, and had no contact with Sana in the relevant period, that's what the record will show. And if they don't believe it, then you provide documentation, same as everyone else." She said it without softening. Not to be harsh, because anything softer would have been condescending, and her father had never responded to condescension, and she wasn't going to start now. Another silence. Then, "How long have you been doing this specific kind of work?" "Institutional investigations? 15 years, off and on." "And you're good at it?" It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "Yes." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. "All right," he said. "I'll be available when they call." "Good." She paused. "Dad." She stopped herself, said it anyway. "I believe you." He was quiet on the other end for a moment that had a specific texture, the texture of a man receiving something he hadn't known he was waiting for. "Thank you," he said. Low, simple. She hung up and finished the coffee, which had gone cold, and went back to work. What? The Pacific Tribune ran the story at 9 a.m. She read it on her phone in the corridor outside the conference room where Dunlap and Prescott were conducting their morning session. The headline was straightforward. Federal investigation at Kellerman Naval Station targets Pacific Fleet Command culture. Senior female admiral assaulted on training pier. The subheader, Rear Admiral Holt relieved of command, multiple installations under review. The story was accurate. Not complete. There were elements still under seal, but accurate in everything it reported. The pier incident was described factually, with the date and time and the rank of the officer involved. Her name appeared in the 4th paragraph. Krall's name appeared in the 8th. Holtz in the 12th. She put the phone in her pocket. By 1100, she had 17 messages she hadn't opened and 2 calls from numbers she didn't recognize. The base public affairs officer forwarded her 3 media inquiry lists. Ames handled all of it with the compressed, slightly shell-shocked efficiency of someone managing a new reality in real time. "You don't have to respond to any of it," Ames said. "I know." Mara handed her the media inquiry lists. "Standard referral to public affairs for everything. Don't add commentary." "Yes, ma'am." "And get me Reeves." Buzz. He'd already seen this story. She could tell when she walked in. He was sitting with his phone on the table in front of him, and he had the look of someone who'd read something 3 times and was still processing the scale of it. "How are you doing?" she said. He looked up. "They used my name." "I know, I'm sorry. I told Dunlap to warn you last night. She should have." "She did. She called at 22:30. He shook his head. "It's not that. It's just—" He stopped. "My mom called. She'd read it. She was—" He pressed his lips together. "She didn't know. About the wrist, the real story. I told her it was a training accident, a real one." He looked at the table. She was crying. Mara sat down across from him. She didn't say anything immediately because there was nothing to say immediately. "She kept saying she was sorry," he said, "that she should have known something was wrong, that I should have called her." He exhaled. "I didn't call her because I didn't want her to think I couldn't handle it." "You handled it the way you knew how," she said, "with the information you had at the time." "That's very— he almost smiled, something rueful in it. "That's a very official way to say I made a mistake. It's an accurate way to say you were 22 in your first posting, and a person with authority over your future told you a lie was your only safe option." She held his gaze. "You're allowed to have handled it imperfectly. Most people do." He sat with that. "The discharge correction, they said it might go through faster now, because of the story." "Sometimes visibility accelerates process," she said. "That's not why I didn't try to delay the story, but it's true." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she hadn't expected. "That man on the pier, Crawl." He looked at her directly. "What happens to him?" "Formal review board. Removal from training duty is already in effect. The board will determine further action." "He's not—" He stopped. "I don't think he's the main thing. What happened to me? Crawl didn't touch me." "I know. The main thing is Cord and Solus and the whole—" He gestured vaguely at the air, at the shape of something too large to point at specifically. "The whole machine of it." "Yes," she said. "The whole machine of it. Is the machine actually going to stop?" She looked at him honestly. "Parts of it will. Some parts have already stopped. The contracting fraud, Sana's company, the procurement chain, that's a federal case now, and federal cases have outcomes. Holt is finished. Solus is finished. Cord's career is finished." She paused. "The deeper structural tendency, institutions protecting themselves over people, that's harder. It doesn't end with one investigation. It gets smaller, slower. You make it cost more than it used to cost, and over time the calculation changes." He considered that. "That's a pretty honest answer." "You asked an honest question." He nodded slowly. Something settled in him that had been unsettled since she'd first walked into the room 2 days ago. Not resolution. Too much was still moving for resolution, but something that looked like the beginning of knowing where the ground was. "Re-enlist," she said. Not in order, quieter than that. He looked at her. "You're good at this. You came 4 hours across a state on a broken wrist because you decided the truth was worth the drive. That's not a quality the Navy makes. It's a quality it should try to keep." She stood. "Think about it. Tit. Greta Sane was arrested by FBI agents at her Phoenix office at 13:47 Pacific time. Mara received the notification from Dunlap in a 2-line text while she was in the middle of a documentation review, and she read it, set the phone down, and continued the documentation review because the arrest was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a different and longer process, and the papers on the desk in front of her still needed to be correct. At 1500, the formal action against Chief Petty Officer Ryan Cord was filed. Removal from the Naval Special Warfare Training Cadre, referral to court-martial on 2 counts of conduct unbecoming, and 1 count of filing false official statements. The filing was public record. It ran on the military news wires within 40 minutes. At 1620, she received word through Dunlap that the IG's Washington office had completed its preliminary review of Edmund Voss's advisory role at Westbrook Point and had determined, based on his documented contract review history and the absence of any communication with Sana in the relevant period, that no further investigation of his role was warranted. The finding was formal and on record. She read it and sent Dunlap a simple acknowledgement, and she did not let herself feel relief for more than a moment, because relief was private and the afternoon still had hours in it. She called her father at 1645. "It's cleared," she said. A long exhale on the other end. The kind of exhale that wasn't just breath. "All right," he said. His voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was something that had been holding itself tight and had just stopped. "I told you," she said. "You did." "I'll be in D.C. in about a week. We should—" She paused. It wasn't a sentence she'd expected to be making, and she wasn't sure yet of its full shape. "We should have dinner." A pause on his end. "I'd like that." "Bring Garrett. He'll want to come anyway. He's been calling me every 6 hours since the story ran." A brief pause that had something almost human in it. "He's worried about you. Tell him I'm fine. You can tell him yourself." "I will," she said. "In a week." She hung up. Sat for a moment with both hands in her lap, looking at nothing in particular. The office was quiet. Outside the window, the compound had gone to its late afternoon rhythm. The light was long and flat, and the Pacific at the edge of the compound was calm today. No whitecaps, just a slow gray movement that had no particular destination. The formal inspection findings were accepted and logged by 1800. Admiral Calloway sent a brief message through the secure channel at 1823 that said, "Well done, more to follow." She sent back an acknowledgement and nothing else. At 1900, she walked to the end of the Kellerman training pier. She didn't have a reason to. The work was done for the day. Ames had the evening communications handled. There was nothing at the end of the pier that needed her presence. She went anyway, because she'd started this story on this pier, in 47-degree water, and there was something unfinished in the air she needed to close. The concrete was dry tonight. The sun was almost down, a strip of amber at the horizon line, fading, and the water below was the color of dark glass. She stood at the end and looked at it. She'd stood on piers her whole life. Her father's pier in Westbrook Point, a child's length of wood extending over brackish water, where he'd taught her to tie the bowline, where he'd later told her what she was and wasn't permitted to want. Piers in Bahrain, in Djibouti, in places she couldn't name in conversation. The pier at the Naval Academy where she'd stood in her first week and understood for the first time that this was real, that she was here, that the door her father had been so certain was closed was open enough to walk through if she went sideways. This pier. She'd gone into the water 4 days ago and come back up. That was not by itself a remarkable thing. She'd done harder things with less preparation in worse conditions and come back up from those too. The remarkable thing was what the water had been carrying under it, the machine that Reeves had described, the whole structural architecture of falsification and protection, and the quiet institutional agreement that certain people's injuries were an accounting category and not a human fact. She hadn't come to Kellerman to dismantle that machine. She'd come to inspect one command. The machine had been there when she arrived, and she'd looked at it closely enough to see its full shape. And then she'd done what she'd always done, the next thing, and the thing after that, and the thing after that. That was not heroism. She'd met enough people who confused methodical persistence with heroism to be clear on the distinction. Heroism was a single decisive moment. What she'd spent 30 years doing was something more boring and more permanent. Showing up, reading the documents, asking the question the room wanted her not to ask, writing down the answer, and doing it again the next day. She thought about what Reeves had said. I didn't know officers like that existed. She thought about what that meant, not as a compliment, she'd stopped needing those years ago, but as information. He'd been 22 in a system that had taught him, by action and by example, that the people with authority over him had authority over the truth about what happened to his body. He'd needed to know that wasn't universal. He'd needed to see it challenged and shown to be wrong. She hadn't done that for him. She'd done it because it was her job and it was right, and the work had to be done. But the effect existed regardless of the intention. She'd received letters before, after other investigations, other actions, other moments where something institutional had been corrected. Letters from people she'd never met in commands she'd never visited, who'd heard about something she'd done and written to say it had mattered to them in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd always kept them, not on display, in a box, a plain cardboard box in a closet in her DC apartment, because they were real and she didn't discard real things, but also because she didn't build her sense of purpose on other people's recognition of it. She'd built it on the work itself, on the precision of it, on the specific satisfaction of a document filed correctly, a question answered honestly, a record corrected so that what it said matched what actually happened. The horizon was nearly dark. The amber was almost gone. She stood on the pier in the quiet, and she thought about her father. Not the version she'd been carrying for 30 years, the pier and the conversation and the 30 seconds that had defined a category in her mind. She thought about the version she'd heard on the phone twice in the last 2 days. The lower voice, the deliberate pauses. The man who'd said, "I made an assumption," and held it long past when I should have known I was wrong. He hadn't been different because of the investigation. He'd been different because he was 76 and time had done what time did, which was remove the certainty that there was more of it. She wasn't ready to reduce 30 years to a dinner and an exhale on the phone. She wasn't going to pretend the pier in Westbrook Point hadn't been real, or that the word sweetheart on the Kellerman Pier 4 days ago hadn't arrived in her chest with 30 years of echo in it. Those things had happened. They were part of the record, the internal one that didn't get corrected by official action. But she was going to have dinner. She was going to sit across from her father in a restaurant in a week, and she was going to let the current version of him be present instead of the version she'd calcified at 52 years old, and she was going to see what was there. That was the work she hadn't done yet. The harder kind, the kind with no documentation, no formal process, no Dunlap to tell her when it was done. She was 52 years old. She had time. She turned and walked back down the pier. 3 weeks later, the Tribune ran a follow-up story. Greta Sana had been indicted on 7 federal counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy, and procurement fraud totaling over $18 million across 4 years and 6 contracts. The indictment named 3 co-conspirators. Holt's name appeared in the text, but not the indictment. He was a cooperating witness, which was the deal his attorney had negotiated, and which was the kind of deal that happened when a man understood that cooperation was the only remaining currency he had. His career was over. His pension was under review. He would not wear the uniform again. Commander Brett Solis received a general court-martial. The charge sheet ran to 11 counts. He was convicted on 8 of them, sentenced to 18 months confinement, reduction in grade to O3, and forfeiture of pay. The conviction was public. It ran on the military wires and the Tribune both, and this time Mara read the story in full, sitting at her desk in D.C. with a coffee that was actually hot, and she noted every count and every detail, and then she closed the article and moved on. Chief Petty Officer Ryan Cord's court-martial was scheduled for the following spring. In the interim, he was confined to base and stripped of all training duties, and the 3 formal complaints he'd managed to suppress over 8 years had been reopened and incorporated into the charge sheet. The men who'd filed those complaints had been contacted. 2 of them had written back. Petty Officer Darren Krall's formal review board resulted in reduction in grade, removal from Bud's cadre assignment, and a letter of reprimand that would follow his service record for the remainder of his career. He did not face criminal charges. The board's finding noted the command climate in which his behavior had developed without excusing it, which was the precise distinction Mara had wanted made and which had been made correctly. She'd written a formal letter to the board, not advocating for any specific outcome, but providing context. The command climate documentation, the Cord training guidance, the pattern that had produced the conditions of the incident. She'd written it in 2 hours, filed it, and hadn't spoken about it to anyone. Marcus Ferris received a formal letter from the Secretary of the Navy acknowledging that his internal complaints had been valid, that the retaliatory transfer had been improper, and that his service record had been corrected to reflect the accurate circumstances of his departure. He'd been offered reinstatement at his previous grade. He was still deciding. She'd called him once, 2 weeks after the story ran. He'd answered, and they'd talked for 12 minutes, and she'd said the same thing she'd said to Reeves. "You came forward. That's on the record, too." He'd been quiet for a moment, and then he'd said, "I didn't think it would go anywhere." She'd said, "Most people don't." And that had been the end of the call. Reeves had submitted his reinstatement application. The processing was ongoing. The dinner happened on a Tuesday in December, in a restaurant near the Navy Yard that Garrett had chosen because it had booths in the back and enough ambient noise to make silence between people less conspicuous. Edmund Voss arrived 7 minutes early, which she'd expected, and was sitting in the booth when she walked in, and he looked older than she'd imagined him looking, older than the version she'd been carrying, and that was new information she absorbed without reaction. He stood when she approached. Old habit, instilled by the same military formation that had produced everything else in him. "Sit down, Dad," she said. He sat. She sat across from him. Garrett arrived 4 minutes later, slightly out of breath, still in his work jacket, and slid into the booth beside their father with the energy of a man who'd been waiting for this to happen and was mildly concerned it might fall apart before it did. They ordered. They talked about Garrett's kids, about the winter, about a renovation Garrett was doing to the kitchen that had been ongoing for 7 months and showed no signs of resolution. Edmund asked questions and listened to the answers and didn't talk about the Navy or the investigation or himself. About 40 minutes in, when the food had arrived and the table had found its rhythm, Edmund set down his fork and looked at Mara directly. "I have something for you," he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the table between them. It was his seal trident. The gold was worn at the edges, the eagle slightly flattened from decades in a box or a pocket or pressed against the fabric of a uniform jacket. It was smaller than she remembered it being when she was 8 years old, which was the specific way significant objects resized themselves over time. She looked at it, looked at him. "You earned something I never gave you credit for," he said. His voice was steady. He'd prepared this, she could tell, had rehearsed the steadiness. "That was all right. I don't know if this is the right thing to give you. It's not your service. It's mine. But it's the only thing I have that—" He stopped, looked for the word. "That carries the weight of what I should have said." She picked it up, held it for a moment. The metal was warm from his jacket pocket, lighter than it looked. She set it back on the table in front of him. "Keep it," she said. He looked at her. "I built my own record," she said. "I don't need yours." She held his gaze. "But I want you to know that I know what it cost you to put it on the table." He was quiet for a moment. Garrett was looking at his plate with the concentrated attention of someone trying to give a moment the space it needed. "It didn't cost me anything," Edmund said. "That's the part that—" He pressed his lips together. "I've been angry at myself for weeks about how easy it was. I should have put it on a table 20 years ago, and it would have cost me nothing then either. That's what I keep thinking about." She didn't say anything. "It should have been harder," he said. "The right thing. It should have required something of me. Instead, it just required me to stop being wrong." He looked at the trident on the table. "That's a very small thing to have taken 30 years. "Sometimes it does," she said. They ate. The restaurant moved around them. Garrett eventually started talking again. About his daughter's college applications, about a logistics problem he'd been handed at work that had no clean solution. And the table moved with him, and the weight of the previous minutes didn't disappear, but it settled into the meal like something that had always been there and had just been waiting for room. She drove home after midnight. The D.C. Streets were quiet and dark, and the monuments were lit in the middle distance, the way they always were, permanent and indifferent to the individual lives moving past them. She thought about what her father had said. "I should have put it on a table 20 years ago, and it would have cost me nothing then either." He was right. The right things rarely cost what people imagined they would. The cost that kept them undone was usually the cost of admission. The moment where you had to acknowledge that you'd been wrong long enough to owe someone something. That moment was the thing people spent decades avoiding. Not the conversation itself, just the door to it. She'd spent 30 years waiting without meaning to wait. Not for his approval. She'd built the career, done the work, run the investigations, been in the room she needed to be in without his approval or anyone else's. But for the acknowledgement that the person she was had always been worth seeing. It had come when it came. She was 52 years old and she was still here, and the record was accurate and the work was ongoing, and the people who had used documentation as a weapon against the people in their care were answering for it in the specific, irreversible way of institutional consequences. And none of that had required anyone to see her coming. That was the thing she'd understood early and carried for 30 years. You didn't need to be seen to be effective. You needed to be right and precise and willing to stay in the room long after the room had decided it didn't want you. You needed to refuse to stop. She'd told a young officer that once, years ago, in a corridor she couldn't now name in a building she could barely picture. You don't need permission, you just refuse to stop. She still believed it. She believed it the way she believed everything she'd earned. Not as inspiration, not as something hung on a wall, as a working principle, as the thing that got you through the next hour and the hour after that, until the record said what it was supposed to say, and the people who'd been told their injuries were administrative categories had their benefits back and their files corrected and their names attached to the truth of what had actually happened. She pulled into her building's parking garage, turned off the car, and sat in the quiet for a moment. The trident was still on the table at the restaurant. She'd left it there deliberately, and her father would take it home. And that was the right arrangement. She had her own record. She had 30 years of it, classified and unclassified, in rooms that were named and rooms that would never be named, and it was accurate, and it was hers. She got out of the car and went inside. Tomorrow there was work. There was always work. That had never been the problem. The work was the thing she knew how to do, the thing she was certain of, the thing that remained when everything else, the arguments about permission and belonging and who was allowed to stand where, had finally run out of ground to stand on. She took the stairs. Not because she needed the exercise, because she'd been taking stairs her whole life, and she wasn't going to stop now. And some habits were the kind that carried you forward, whether you were thinking about them or not. She went home, and she rested, and in the morning she began again.